So then after organisms figured out this whole idea of photosynthesis, then it was really kind of off to the races. So about 2.7 billion years ago, what became prominent on Earth were the photosynthesizers, specifically the cyanobacteria like Anabina and Oscillatoria, things that when look at in lab. And they were the oxygen producers, and that revolutionized the Earth. That changed life on Earth considerably. If you remember back from your discussions in Bio 1 and respiration, remember the difference in the energy yield between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, right? You get much, much more ATP out of aerobic respiration than anaerobic. And that means organisms can get bigger and they get more complex. So that's kind of oxygen in the foreshadowing of what the whole significance of this is. But I really want to impress on how the massive amount of oxygen producers there were. There are these things that exist on Earth. These things that are called stromatolites. In the lower right, you can see them. And stromatolites are masses of algae. Organisms, of algal organisms, bacterial organisms that are growing on top of one another. And then what they're doing is they're sequestering minerals from the environment around them, and they're building up these huge columns. Well, as you see in the picture down below, what really that is showing is a lot of these columns that have been eroded. These are found very often on the edge of on coastlines. And I guess what I'm trying to impress upon you is the thickness of the column. And just imagine the density of these photosynthesizers. And that's the important thing, the density. I mean, there were massive amounts of them, and they produced a tremendous amount of oxygen, which caused the oxygen levels in the water to initially to rise, which combined with the iron in the water made rust. But then the excess after that, the excess oxygen, as these photosynthesizers continued to photosynthesize, the excess oxygen made its way into the atmosphere. Now, the anaerobic prokaryotes didn't like this. This wasn't good for them because they weren't adapted to dealing with oxygen. Remember, oxygen is a horrible oxidizer, and even though it's needed, it's something that if you're not adapted to it can destroy you very quickly. So a lot of these anaerobic prokaryotes began to die off, although some of them survived in ways that we'll talk about in just a second, and some very efficient sort of strategies, specifically this thing called endosymbiosis. So about 500 million years after this started, so at about 2.2 billion years ago, just a little over 2 billion years ago, the rise in oxygen level on Earth was dramatic. And at this time, we start to see the rise of more complex cells, so moving out of the prokaryotic cells into the eukaryotic cells, and then eventually into the eukaryotic cells and eukaryotic algae with chloroplasts. If you remember from your Bio 1, chloroplast, that's that organelle that's needed for photosynthesis. If we look at this chart, you can see what I'm talking about, just about this 2 billion year break. So here we are at about just after that 1.8 billion years. We have something called the oxygen revolution. So this was when the oxygen levels, if you look at that graph, rose dramatically. Look at that y-axis. That's a logarithmic scale, so that means that every jump is 10 times more. So those oxygen levels, when we're talking about punctuated equilibrium, rose dramatically about 1.8 million years ago, and this contributed to the rise of eukaryotic or bigger life that needed more energy, that needed to extract more ATPs out of that gram of carbohydrates than do it anaerobically. As I said, some of the anaerobic prokaryotes weren't very happy about this, while the eukaryotic organisms got the benefit of this increased metabolic rate from using oxygen or increased metabolic output. The anaerobic organisms were on the run. Many of them faced extinction. But as I said, some of them survived in a kind of a you help me and I'll help you relationship, something we call a symbiotic relationship. Now, we'll talk a lot about symbiotic relationships this semester, but symbiotic relationships are relationships that occur between two or more organisms, and they can involve things like parasitism, mutualism, where you help each other out. Predation would be a symbiotic relationship. It doesn't mean the relationship has to be good for both. Mutualism would be an example of good for both. And there's another one that's called commensalism. Commensalism is one organism gains a benefit in the relationship, and the other one is neither harmed nor helped. The egrets here in Florida, the birds that follow the cattle around, that's a commensalistic relationship. The cattle kick up insects off of the turf for the birds to eat. And the birds don't help or hurt the cows in any way. They don't interact with the cows at all. So the birds give them a benefit, and the cows are neutral. So that would be a commensalistic relationship. clownfish that live in the tentacles of sea anemone would be a mutualistic relationship. They both gain a benefit. So this endosymbiotic or this endosymbiosis, that's where some of the anaerobic prokaryotes ended up. What we mean. So in addition to this endosymbiosis thing that I'm going to talk about in just a second, I want to talk about some of the other things that were going on during this time. So as we're moving through about 1.8 to 1.2 billion years ago, we start to see multicellular eukaryotes. It's hard to find fossils of organisms without hard bony parts. So the fossil record is unclear here, but the oldest known multicellular eukaryote we have is from about 1.2 billion years ago. And again, all of this rise in oxygen levels allowed for greater complexity in unicellular forms. It allowed for the development of organelles, which the prokaryotes didn't have, and it allowed for cytoskeleton components in eukaryotic cells. This increased oxygen, this ability to extract more energy, this ability to get more resources out of your environment had consequences, right? It allowed organisms to become more specialized, allowed organisms to become more precise in the way they go about doing their metabolic activities with these different advent of organelles that we see in eukaryotic cells. And again, the cytoskeleton allowed organisms or allowed cells to engulf. You see in the picture down below, right? Endocytosis, which you learned about in Bio 1. That was something that came out of this rise of multicellular eukaryotic life, or at least initially unicellular eukaryotic life. So oxygen had a major impact on these organisms. It allowed for advanced metabolism, a higher energy extraction from food, a lot more complex and sophisticated body structures. But as I said, it wasn't great for everybody, right? It wasn't great for everybody, this rise of oxygen. A lot of prokaryotes out there that were anaerobic, the rise in oxygen levels were detrimental to them. Some organisms that were able to survive during many years on Earth went extinct during this oxygen revolution, which again occurred relatively rapidly. But there were some that stuck around, and these were the ones that entered into this endosymbiotic relationship. So we go back to the previous slide where eukaryotic cells were developing this ability to engulf, right? That's because of the cytoskeleton. So there was this natural tendency for cells to engulf things, to engage in phagocytosis and pinocytosis and receptor-mediated endocytosis. There was a tendency for them to do that. So the hypothesis, this endosymbiotic theory, the hypothesis behind it is that what happened is that through time, some of these engulfing eukaryotic cells, in one case, one would have engulfed an aerobic bacterium. Now, this was a bacterium, an independent living organism, and this bacterium, through time, eventually became the mitochondria of cells. And we know what a mitochondria does to cells, right? It switches you from anaerobic to aerobic. So the benefit that the bacterium would have gotten would be protection inside of this engulfing eukaryotic cell, assuming that it didn't eat it, right? And the benefit that the cell would get would be, instead of, 2 ATPs out of anaerobic, you're getting 32, 36 out of aerobic. And then in another scenario, a cell could have engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, right? Something similar to like the algae that you see in the picture in the upper right, that green algae. And it might have been some sort of and algae is a strange term. We'll use it a lot this semester, but an algae can be a plant, it can be a prokaryote, it can be a protozoan. That you see in the green up there, that green algae, that's the prokaryotic green algae. That's the term algae used for the prokaryote. So basically what happened is some engulfing eukaryotic cell engulfed an aerobic bacterium and became aerobic, which would have been a benefit, right? And another one, or because plant cells have mitochondria and chloroplast, engulfed a chloroplast and had the ability to photosynthesize, which would have had a benefit as well. And so this might explain some of the observations we make about mitochondria and chloroplasts. Mitochondria and chloroplasts both have their own DNA. They both are shaped kind of like a prokaryotic cell, and they both divide within the cell through binary fission, essentially, the same way that prokaryotic cells do. So a lot of indications to support the idea that these were free-living organisms at one time, entering into an endosymbiotic relationship. Symbiotic to help each other, right? Or symbiotic means you interact with each other. This would be a mutualistic endosymbiotic relationship. The endo referring to the fact that one organism engulfed another one. All right, so now we're going to jump ahead about 500 million years. There wasn't a whole lot going on. There was some evolution. It was mostly during that gradualism time that Darwin understood about the pace of evolution. There wasn't a lot of punctuated equilibrium going on. The Earth went through a very cold period known as the snowball Earth from about 1 billion years up until what we see right here. But then, in matter of fact, the snowball Earth to the point where the entire Earth was covered in one giant glacial ice sheet all the way down the equator. Geologists have found evidence of boulders that are carried only by glaciers, and they find those in the deserts of Africa down around the equator. So the only way that could have happened in that time period would have been that the entire Earth was covered by this layer of ice. Life still survived during this really harsh time of the snowball Earth, maybe in some of those hydrothermal vents or even in the ice. But as all things happen, or as things occur, things change. So at about 500 million years ago, something called the Cambrian explosion occurred. An explosion because it was an explosion in diversity. If you look at the chart down below, we go from about, I'd say 635 million years ago. We've got a couple of different types of animals, the sponges and some of the jellyfish, the cnidarians are there. But look what happens as we move into about 575, 515 million years ago, where we have this tremendous amount of branching. So that's what we mean by explosion. A lot of diversity occurred during that time. It wasn't exactly an explosion. It lasted about 25 to 100 million years, so it's a pretty long fuse. This bothered Darwin, by the way. I think I mentioned to it the other day when we were talking about him. When you look at the fossil record and you see this rapid explosion of life, and remember, he only understood the pace as gradualism. This is because of punctuated equilibrium. It bothered him because it seemed like the diversity of life was just too fast for what he knew about the pace of evolution. We'll talk a little more about some of these critters as we get to them in detail and their place in history, but the big thing that happened during the Cambrian explosion that drove so much of this diversity was an arms race. About this time, organisms developed mouths, jaws and teeth and things by which to eat each other with, and that starts an arms race. And that's an extremely heavy selective pressure, which would very strongly select for those organisms who can win that arms race. Right? Cambrian explosion, about 500 or so million years ago. Dig through the fossil record, there's very little before that. After that, it's almost like somebody let the door open. The critters everywhere, all kinds of diversity. Most all the major groups of animals that, like you see in the chart here, most all the major groups arose during the Cambrian explosion, during this short 25 to 100 million year lifetime, or span of time. So that's a real punctuated equilibrium thing. Now, soon after that, plants began to move onto land about 500 million years ago. That has a lot to do with the fact that continents began to form about 500 million years ago. Before that time, there was land on Earth, but it was like splotches of land scattered throughout. And these began to converge and form larger continents. And so land masses became bigger. Plants began to move onto land about 500 million years ago, but they didn't move out on the land alone. We'll talk more about this when we talk about plants. But this again illustrates that incredible delicate balance of life. Plants have a fungus that grows on their roots known as mycorrhizae. That's that word you see there, mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is a fungus. It's a symbiont, right? The plant provides something for the fungus provides something for the plant. But what the fungus does for the plant mostly is fungi, which we'll talk about, digest material on the outside of their bodies. So the fungus that lives around the roots of these plants is digesting organic material, food in the environment, and it's forming this soup of nutrients. Now the fungus doesn't use all of that, but the plant absorbs the other part of it. So mycorrhizae fungus living on the roots of plants make plants much more efficient at extracting nutrients out of soil. And the first plants that would have moved out on the land would have needed every advantage they could get, including these mycorrhizae, because the first critters out on the land, the pioneer plants, they would have had it pretty tough. Now, they may have been able to eke out a living, and many times what plants do is the first set of plants, the pioneer plants, actually change the environment, make it easier for plants later on to survive. But no doubt those first plants would have needed every advantage they could have. And the mycorrhizae helped, and then the arthropods, the insects and the pollinators that we'll learn a lot more about in subsequent chapters, that helped when they began to diversify soon afterwards, about 50 or so million years ago. Any organism that moves out on the land is going to have a problem with desiccation, so we'll talk about that when we get into more specifics of the plants and the animals. But one of the things that plants did when they moved on the land was they started producing these waterproof coatings on their leaves. Red mangroves here in Florida, the leaves of a red mangrove, you feel it, they're waxy, they're thick, they have a waxy coating. Just like the chapstick on your lips, the wax is intended to help, it's an anti-desiccant, help them from drying out. Desiccation, big red letters there. That's going to be the number one environmental pressure, or one of the number one environmental pressures of organisms when they move from water onto land. And we'll talk about how plants dealt with it. We have a little bit, and we'll also talk about animals. But plants, of course, once they eked out a living, they created opportunities for everything else to survive. Because you need plants to change the soil, you need plants for other things to eat. Here's a really cool picture. This is through the root of a plant, so you're looking like down the root, like they slice the root crosswise, and all of that around the outside, those what they're calling the arpuscular containing cells. You can actually see in the little inset picture. Those are all. So that's the plant root, but these are all fungal cells that are going in amongst the root of the plant. So 95% of all plants living on land have these mycorrhizae living around the roots. That's how important this fungus is. Well, so the diversity of life is increasing. We've got the Cambrian explosion, but for every good day, there's a bad day. And we've had them on Earth in terms of diversity. There have been a number of extinctions. The red line is the extinction rate. There's been a number of extinctions through time, but remember, the exit of the old is sometimes good for the new, because you notice in the blue line, in spite of the fact that we've had these periodic extinctions, there's 5 major recognized ones. I've indicated those with the red arrows down below the x-axis there. But notice the number of families has continued to increase. So diversity of organisms on the planet has continued to increase. There was a little dip at the beginning of the Mesozoic. That's when the dinosaurs start coming into prominence. But nonetheless, we have an increase in the number of families. Like I said, 5 recognized mass extinctions on Earth, 5 big ones. Some say we might be in the middle of a 6th that's caused by humans with what we're doing to the habitat and how we're influencing organisms. We're going to talk about 2 of them. Talk about one that ended at the end of the Permian. That was 251 million years ago down below, the end of the Paleozoic. And then, of course, we'll talk about the one of the Cretaceous, which is at the end of the Mesozoic, which is 65.5 million years ago. So let's look at the Permian. The Permian extinction about 240, 250, somewhere around there, million years ago, wiped out about 90% of all marine species, about a third of all insects, and it happened pretty doggone quick, about 5 million years, which is pretty rapid in geological terms. Geologists separate those eras that we were looking at based on major geological events, and biologists kind of adopt that as well. So it's this major geological event, this Permian extinction, that forms the boundary between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic. And always remember, the Mesozoic is the middle era, and the Mesozoic is the dinosaur era. 2 things we think may have led to this Permian extinction: the formation of Pangaea, that supercontinent of Pangaea, when all the continents, as I said, they were all little bubbles of land, and they all coalesced together. What they did when they coalesced together is they formed large interior spaces of land, which would have dried out, and that would have caused environmental pressure to organisms living there. There was less shoreline, swampy, wet, moist, really good kind of areas for living things. Organisms had to deal much more with drying out when they moved inland too, when these continents began to form. Continents get big, they stay wet on the edges, but they get dry in the interiors. Another thing that happened, especially for marine species, is when these little islands of land began to grow and finally became this big continent of Pangaea, it actually reduced the amount of coastline. Most life in the ocean lives around the coastline. Very little of it is out there in the middle of the ocean. Most of it's right around the shoreline. So that's where most of the nutrients are, and that's where it's shallow enough so photosynthesizers can photosynthesize, and we can get the basis of the food web, right? But during the time of this Permian extinction, the shoreline decreased because those little islands with all their little individual shorelines grew together in one big giant continent. So that destroyed a lot of habitat. One of the biggest reasons why organisms go extinct is because of that. Volcanoes, too. Volcanoes, as we talked about since the beginning of Earth, have been around, but volcanoes during the Permian era, there was an era or a time of heightened volcanic activity. I mean, massive volcanoes, right? We all know that the Earth is these series of plates. We all know the Earth is these series of plates that are floating on this semi-rigid magma layer and bumping into one another and diving between one another and forming like the Ring of Fire, which you see the red dots all around the Pacific Ocean. And this is all evidence of volcanic activity, right? This is all evidence of tectonic activity, and volcanoes are part of that. So as these plates are moving away from one, and Pangaea, if you imagine, was the entire world's continents all together, and now they're separating. Like the Atlantic is getting wider and the Pacific is getting narrower. So there's the Permian at the bottom. There's Pangaea. You see, so as Pangaea formed, right, we lost a lot of coastline. But then as Pangaea moves into the Mesozoic and begins to separate into Laurasia and Gondwanaland and the continents move apart, we start to form shoreline back again. But back during the 250 million year ago extinction of the Permian, the formation of Pangaea decreased habitat. Now, as you can imagine, these continents are coming together and drifting apart. Environments are changing, and that's providing opportunities or at least challenges for critters to adapt. It's also providing opportunities for organisms to speciate, for speciation to occur. Because remember, that's how speciation happens. A population changes a little bit through time until you get new species. And that's going to be brought out more and more so as the environment is changing, especially as the environment changes quickly. Here we go. There's Pangaea. So the ocean's deeper. The inshore water area got reduced, so there wasn't as much shoreline like I was saying. The inland climates became cooler and they became drier, which would have favored organisms that could deal with that dry climate, not only the plants, but again, think about what happens after Pangaea forms. Pangaea forms at the Permian extinction 250 million years ago. Right after that, the dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are reptiles, and reptiles, as we'll talk about later on, figured out a really unique way to deal with these dry climates. So they rose to dominance. This is when the dinosaurs come on. This is what I mean about volcanic activity. This is a map in Russian. I couldn't find a comparable one in English, although it doesn't matter. These are areas of Russia. But what we're talking about volcanic activity, we're not talking about a few volcanoes going off. We're talking about these massive, see that area outlined in the blue? These are called the Siberian traps. The Siberian traps look something like what you see in the picture there. It was huge, continent-size, massive lake of lava and volcanic activity. So we're not talking just about a few volcanoes. We're talking about some significant volcanic activity, which would, even one volcano erupting today, there are climate effects of that. You can imagine some volcanic activity a third of the size of Russia. That would definitely cause some change in the Earth. So that brought out the Permian extinction. But as I said, the extinction of one group of organisms sometimes leads to the rise of another, and here we are. In the Mesozoic, right after the Permian, these guys dominated. And they dominated for 200 or so million years and did quite a good job diversifying into hundreds of different species, occupying different habitats in the water. There were swimming, flying ones, herbivores, carnivores. There was everything in the mix. Small ones, big ones. You've seen them all in the movies. The dinosaurs. They were the big ones. And they were doing quite well for 250 or so million years. But then 65 million years ago or so, an asteroid about the size of Manhattan slammed into the Earth somewhere near the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, wiping out about 50% of all marine species, many families of terrestrial plants, animals, And I guess I should fix this now. It says all dinosaurs. That's not really true, right? Birds are dinosaurs. All dinosaurs but bird dinosaurs were wiped out during this time. Now, how do we know this happened? How do we know this is one singular event? Well, that's a really neat part of a piece of detective work, something called the Alvarez theory. And I'm pointing to it with the red arrow, the little dark black line. In geology, as we talked about, if you go back through the layers of rock, you go back in time. So in this stratification of rock here, that line, or that red arrow, is pointing to the line of that was on the surface of the Earth 65 million years ago. And you notice it's got a very thin but very distinct dark black line. That dark black line is made up of an element known as iridium. Iridium is a rare element on Earth, but a much more abundant element on asteroids. All over the Earth, no matter where you go, when you dig down to 65 million years, you find that same black line. That black line with its iridium is evidence of an asteroid, a huge asteroid, smacking into the Earth, peeling away the crust like you do peel on an orange, and just causing global catastrophe. Not only with the impact, right, and the fireball and all that stuff, and all the glowing rock layers that were dumped up into the atmosphere and then fell down and caused fires, but all the stuff that was dumped up in the air, blocked out photosynthesis, or blocked out a lot of the sun, decreased photosynthesis in the herbivores. Think about what a brontosaurus dinosaur must have eaten in a day. Huge herbivores. They began to die off, and the carnivores began to die off, and the only ones that survived during this time were the smaller ones, right? Like the bird-like dinosaurs, and also the mammals are coming through this period as well. Now, the mammals arose during early in the dinosaur era. Mammals were around, but they were pretty much kept in check by the dinosaurs until this event occurred. So it's no small thing to say that without this asteroid strike, we might not be here. We might still be run by the dinosaurs. Never know. There we go. That's where it hit. Right off the Yucatan Peninsula in the Chicxulub crater. They are actually doing some oil exploration, so maybe that's a picture down below what it looked like on that day when it happened. But they were doing some oil exploration off the Yucatan Peninsula, and the geologists found a big crater. That was always the smoking gun for this asteroid theory, the Alvarez theory. Where was the crater? And they did eventually find it. So, what did this lead to after that? Well, if you go on the time scale down below, you know, it's especially after about 50 or 75 million years ago that those funnels or those tubes, what's that called, a bell on a trumpet, gets much wider, right? And if you look at, for example, just amongst the mammals, now the monotremes that we'll talk about are very odd mammals, the platypus. They didn't do a whole lot after that, but the marsupials, kangaroos, our buddy the opossum, they went through a diversification, but certainly the other type of mammals, the mammals that we're probably most familiar with, the placental ones, underwent a diversification. So this is a worldwide adaptive radiation. I'm just showing you in the mammals, but amongst other species it worked the same way too, especially among the birds and other reptiles too. There were also regional sorts of events that occurred. Like, for example, if we look at these species of tarweed, which is, or not species of tarweed, but species related to the North American tarweed that's found out there on Hawaii. And you notice what's interesting about this is the fossil evidence suggests, for example, that these relatives of the tarweed arose on Kauai 5 million years ago, Oahu 3.7 million years ago. The Big Island of Hawaii, less than 500,000 years ago. The reason, if you know something about plate tectonics and the formation of these islands, the Hawaiian Islands are being formed through a hot spot in the Earth's crust. As the Earth's crust or the plates move over that hot spot, it forms a volcanic eruption occurs, like we saw, throughout the summer. So Kauai is the oldest island, and then the plate is moving up to the northwest, up to the upper left, and then as that plate moves over the hotspot, it's forming newer and newer islands. So Hawaii is only about 500,000 years old, and if we look at the evidence of the tarweed on there, we see that it's only been around that long. So we had regional and worldwide adaptive radiations that occurred, especially after the dinosaurs. A lot of selective pressure was removed, if you will, when the dinosaurs went extinct. All right, last little thing I want to talk about is how do we get certain evolutionary novelties? This is a question sometimes that's brought up to counter ideas about evolution. Where do eyes? Eye is a pretty complicated thing, and feathers and legs. Where do these very complicated structures come from? If evolution is chance, random mutations that occur, then how do we mutate all at once something as complex as an eye, or the feather of a bird, or the structure of a tetrapod, of a land animal's legs? Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary biologist, contemporary evolutionary biologist, asks the question, what good is 5% of an eye? Now, it's a hypothetical question, but he's asking, what good is part of an eye? An eye, as it is, only functions when all the parts are there. What good is part of a feather? You can't fly with part of a feather. You can't walk with part of a leg. Well, these evolutionary novelties are things we call exaptations, okay? Exaptations are things that evolved, or structures that evolved and had a evolutionary purpose at that time, but through time became fortuitous in another context, or a more, let's say, advanced kind of context. Let me show you what I mean by this. Now, we're going to talk about feathers and legs when we get into we're going to talk about feathers and legs when we get into birds and we start talking about tetrapods, but I will bring up eyes right now. Let's talk about how an evolutionary novelty like an eye occurred. Now, what's interesting about this is we can follow this as from panel A through E in this slide. We can follow this as sort of an evolutionary history of the eye, or the history of the evolution of the eye. But we can also see this in existing critters today. And that's some of the beauty behind studying evolution. When we look back in through the fossil record, we see evolutionary things that have changed, and we see critters today that sometimes are still remnants of that. Like when we get into fish, we'll talk about the coelacanth, which is a lobe-finned fish. Now, it's not your typical fish, but it represents fish from an area a long time ago that eventually gave rise to critters with legs. Now, coelacanths don't spring legs. They are fish, but they're related to those critters, and they're still around today. So these critters, like an A, the patella, which is a limpet, that's a mollusk, the Pleurotomeria, which is another mollusk, and nautilus, all of these in these slides are all mollusks, see loligo in the lower right, the squid, that are alive today. And this is the eyes they have. So this is a kind of a treat through, or a walk through history, as well as looking at species today that still have this. And the idea is, what good is part of an eye? Well, let's look at what an eye does. An eye senses light. So in the limpet, the patella, there's no eye, but there is now, and there may have been in evolutionary past, we look at the fossil record, a layer of pigmented cells. Cells that can sense light. Now, how would that be an advantage? Well, you can't tell an image, but you can tell dark from light. So you might be able to tell when a predator, say you live in the ocean, you might be able to tell when a predator, or you can tell when a shadow passes overhead. You may not know, okay, that shadow is a predator, but you basically duck into defensive cover whenever a shadow passes over top. That would be an evolutionary advantage, right? Hiding from the predator. You might be an organism that follows and feeds upon things that photosynthesize in a lake. So you're going to want to, during the day, when the photosynthesizers maybe float or swim to the top to photosynthesize, you're going to want to follow them. So you're going to want to be able to sense the light. Okay, that would be an advantage. Now, if you take that patch of pigmented cells and you form them into a cup, then basically what you do is you give a sense of direction to that light. So now it's just not a shadow passing overhead. Because the pigmented cells are arranged in a C shape, you can tell a little bit about what direction it's coming from and how it's moving. Now, down below, we're going to kind of move through those. Basically, what you're doing is you're adding a lens, all right? So as you add a lens and you modify that lens, and as you fill in that cavity with fluid, what you're basically doing is increasing the visual acuity, the ability to see of the organism, until you finally get down to the squid. And squid have what we call a camera lens type eye. That's what we have. We have a camera lens type eye. We see the world in distinct images, pretty much the way squid do. I've done some scuba diving on squid, and I will tell you they're interesting because they'll check you out. So I wonder sometimes if they have really good vision. But you could see what we mean by an evolutionary novelty, right? By an exaptation. The pigmented cells would have benefited the limpet. It would have benefited the limpet's ancestors. They can see a shadow. The eye cup would have benefited the Pleurotomeria today, as well as its ancestors, by being able to tell the direction of the light. The pinhole eye that we find in the nautilus, the one with the lens, and then the much more complex one with the lens, would have all increased visual acuity and would have provided a selective advantage for that critter at that time. So when it goes back to Stephen Jay Gould's question, what good is 5% of an eye? Nothing. But it's not an eye at the time. An eye is just a light-sensing organ, and patella, the limpet in the upper left, has a light-sensing organ. It's not particularly sophisticated, but it would have been beneficial, especially if that light-sensing organ allowed you to survive, right? And that's all about adaptation. That also explains feathers and legs, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Birds, just as a hint, birds did not evolve feathers to fly. They evolved feathers for another reason. And animals didn't evolve legs to walk on land. They evolved legs for another reason, or leg-like structures. So we'll talk about more of them when we get into that. But that's where those evolutionary novelties come from. Little tiny modifications that in the end, add up to something big, a really complex structure, but convey a selective advantage. If they didn't convey a selective advantage along the way, this patch of pigmented cells or the pinhole type eye, the organisms wouldn't survive, and that structure wouldn't be carried on throughout evolutionary history, right? Makes sense. All right, one of the other misperceptions that we get in evolution is the fact there's a goal. I'm trying to make a perfect critter. And so I've already talked about this, so I don't need to go over this too much, but this is the evolution of the horse. There's only one species of horse alive today. Horses basically got taller. They shrank the number. They lost some of their finger bones. They became splints, and so a horse's leg today is really only one finger bone. It allows them to run faster and be much more agile. And they moved out of their habitats. Hyracotherium down at the bottom lived in grassy type habitats. It was more of a browser, whereas the ones up above were grazers, moved out in the open area. So when you moved out into the open area and you're a horse and you're subject to being preyed upon, you're going to get big and you're going to get fast. And so that's what we see in the evolution of the horse. But notice what we mean by having no goal in mind. There's a lot of stops and starts along the way. These are all horses and horse-like ancestors that were prominent. You know, look at Myohippus there in the middle. It was around from 37 million years ago, 38 million years ago to 16 million years ago. So that's quite a while. Right? So these animals have survived, but no goal in mind. This is just a random, and no goal in mind because the environment is changing. You can't have a goal if you don't know what the environment's going to be like. Okay, and this is where we'll be moving through the rest of the semester. Well, with the Cambrian explosion, we'll move in and we'll start talking about, we'll talk about prokaryotes who were around before the Cambrian, protozoans as well. The Cambrian explosion, we'll really start talking about land plants. Of course, with the first land plants, you see the invertebrates begin to dominate. That has a lot to do with the plants moving on the land. And notice on the right how the Earth is changing too. The continents are changing. There's Pangaea at about 500 million years ago. Pangaea at about 250 million years ago. There's the first continent, as the continents come together on Earth about 500 million years ago. So we go through the evolution of the plants, insects, and then fish in very broad sense, amphibians, reptiles, the cone plants. Then began arriving on the scene during the dinosaur era. Of course, there's the dinosaur, the Mesozoic. Mammals were around as well. They died off. The dinosaurs did. And then, of course, we have the radiation. A lot going on in the end. Mostly not because we have a lot more evidence, a lot more documentation from the fossil record in the last, tens of millions of years than we have for the hundreds of millions of years before. So we'll go through each one of these. We'll talk about each one of these organisms and explain them in a little more detail as we get into them.